Capitol Hill, where I'd like to bring in Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff. He is the ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman Schiff, thanks for joining us. I want to ask you about especially these legitimate concerns regarding the ransom portion of this new policy, opening up the door to negotiate with terrorists and the good faith with no guarantees. So let me play you what House Speaker John Boehner has said this morning. Listen.
And the concern that I have is that by lifting that long-held principle, you could be endangering more Americans here and overseas.
All right, given that, do you share that concern that, hey, terrorists and kidnappers now say, hey, you know what, they'll play as far as the families and pay? Is that a concern that you share?
Well, there is a risk that you open the door to families being able to pay ransoms, and it may encourage more hostage-taking. But I think importantly, the administration is saying that the government is still going to maintain its policy against making concessions to terrorists. So the government itself is not going to engage in any kind of a negotiation that involves concessions. I think really what the administration is saying here is something that frankly was just common sense, and that is we are never going to prosecute a family for doing everything they can to secure the release of a loved one. That's the humane position. It's also a very practical position. As a former prosecutor, I can tell you the idea of going to a jury with a case against a family for trying to rescue a loved one, that would never fly. So I think we're really stating the obvious in terms of family and prosecution. It does open the door to the idea that hostage takers out there may now look at Americans as potentially financially rewarding. But frankly, terrorists have had plenty of incentive to kidnap Americans separate and apart from the ransoms.
Sure. Well, let's talk about this and how realistic it would be for these families, given the fact that now there's that leeway, no prosecution. But we're talking about, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars here at some point. You know, the European governments up to $125 million in what they've paid. Sometimes we've seen, you know, $100 million asked for ransom. How realistic would that be for these families to raise this kind of money without even tapping to the U.S. government or other governments for help, too?
Well, I think for most families it won't be realistic at all to raise that kind of money. Now, it may depend if someone who's kidnapped works for an organization that has the wherewithal and the willingness to try to provide a payment to get a hostage back. But, you know, we do have to be very mindful of the fact that to the degree any ransom is paid, it really does help fund these organizations to kidnap other people or commit other terrorist acts. So it's certainly not something we want to encourage. But I do think it's important that the administration is saying also that it may communicate with hostage takers that can buy time. It can also gain information that might be necessary for a rescue attempt. So I think that's a sound change, as well as the organizational changes that will help harmonize our policy in this area. I think are all a good step forward.
Sure. With the reassurance that these families can get with the making of this fusion cell, what it's called, this team of people who will work to open up communications for these families, especially.
I particularly like, Frances, the fact that we can declassify and share information about their loved ones with the family so they can be brought into the process. A lot of these families will hire private negotiators and they may gather their own intelligence. So having that free flow of information between the family and the I think is a good thing.
And that's the disappointment we've heard time and again from these families, that they were kept in the dark. Congressman Adam Schiff, we thank you for your time.